What is happening? Good evening, everybody. Today is Thursday, November 21st, and I'm back to make another vlog. Um, Last Saturday, I got on Facebook and I made a video. I'm talking about an event that I am a part of that's happening in 2 weeks from tomorrow. It is a Christmas concert and fundraiser for multiple different causes. Um, so I made a video about that, and as I was making that video, I found myself trailing into this topic of vulnerability. So I said in that video that I was going to make another vlog that went into a little bit more detail about this topic of vulnerability. So, um, if you know anything about vulnerability, just as it is, it's a very difficult action, I guess you can call, to embrace. So, bear with me. I'm going to do my absolute best. I think what qualifies me to talk about this topic is just my artistic journey that I have been on in the realm of hip hop for the last 6 to 7 years. Um, and just creating music and releasing it publicly um, has obviously required for me to get vulnerable. So since I've been doing that for a while, I feel that I have at least some type of, at least some level of qualification to talk about the topic. So um, the thought that I had as I was making that video last Saturday um, was talking about um, just the model of vulnerability that we see from God and from Jesus. Just to restate and re-describe that thought that I'd shared, basically, God models vulnerability through his offering, giving his son Jesus Christ, becoming a man, and coming down to the level of a human being. So being God, then coming down to the level of a human being, living a perfect life to do nothing but serve other people, and then blamelessly get crucified and get killed, so that there would be a sacrifice for the um, I don't exactly know the theological or the biblical term for it, but the lack of connection, or the lack of um, the disconnect of relationship between God and between man. So he offers himself and goes through a brutal death so that we can have right standing with him through Christ's defeating of death and then resurrection. Um, so showing that death, which is the largest thing that ultimately drives fear in human beings, no longer has power through Christ. So why that is a model of vulnerability is because through the action of God giving that and making that available for his people, he literally went to the cross and was killed, and which was an act of love, because he took the punishment that human beings should receive, as a result of the fall of man and the disconnect of relationship with God. So Christ took that punishment for us, so that we don't have to experience death eternally, if that makes sense. But the thing about it is, what makes God so vulnerable, or what made Jesus so vulnerable in this whole scenario, is that we ultimately have a choice whether or not we want to choose to receive what God is giving us. And the reality is there's no guarantee that we make that choice for Jesus. So literally, like, God gives us the most incredible like action of love, and there's no guarantee that the one He's giving it to is going to receive it. And I think that's really important when it comes to vulnerability. The thing about vulnerability is you completely expose and present everything that you are, or at least an area that is unfiltered, unguarded, basically exposing something, and allow for people to comment, reject, or criticize what it is that you're presenting in an unfiltered way. Um, so that's the idea of vulnerability. I wanted to just paint that picture and really just put things into context that God really, the thought that I had was that God like really models this well, and that's why it's important. It's important because we see how much He loves us, and then we have the opportunity to choose or receive that love and then give it back, which forms relationship and forms connection. So when we receive Jesus' love as a result of what He has done, we then have this returning relationship where we love God back and we want to serve God, we want to live for God. And that's like where actual connection is happening. And so that's really important, and I feel like it's important to God. And that's why it's also important to us as human beings. So there's a reason it's so hard to be vulnerable. There's definitely a reason for that, because it's a risk. At the end of the day, like when you're being vulnerable with somebody, you're risking something, because you're leaving something out in the open for somebody, and letting go of control of how somebody else receives or does anything like that. So you're risking at the end of the day, and that's why it's so hard and so scary, because just naturally as humans we're driven by fear. So I think that's just what I wanted to talk about. I put a lot of emphasis on that for a reason, and I guess that really ties in a lot to just what I have learned from vulnerability throughout the years. Like, now my experience with it has been, I would say from like middle school into high school and going into college. One of my like main priorities that I had were what other people thought of me and like what my perception was to other people. So since that was at such high, priority to me, I had to protect this reputation that I thought that I had, so that everybody, I could do what I could so that everybody could think a certain way of me, but never actually really see like, the real me. Until, I started going through different things in life that were challenging, and actually finding people who were going through difficult things in life as well, who would then open up and share. And eventually I got more comfortable over time with being vulnerable, just as life got harder, and as I was seeking answers and wanting to have conversations with other people. I just found myself opening up, and then I think that's like really when it started for me. So I don't know exactly when, like I finally broke past some of those barriers of what it, had the courage, and I can't exactly remember like the moments where I, was vulnerable and then formed connections with people. But what I realized is that it was happening at a more and more frequent rate as I was going through like high school and college. So my experience has been like vulnerability has been something that I have gotten comfortable with, I guess, over time. I think where I've ran into kind of like a curve, or where my world got flipped upside down, is when I started to become vulnerable, And then when I would be vulnerable, I would put an expectation on other people to accept and embrace what I was being vulnerable with. And then what would happen is if somebody wouldn't embrace me during a time of vulnerability, um, I would find myself in a difficult place, and then I'd start questioning, myself, and then also forming like resentment towards other people who weren't ready to embrace, you know, some things that I was presenting to them in a vulnerable way. And it didn't take. I didn't realize this, until maybe about this year, um, just as I actually tried to learn a little bit more about this topic. Um, and wrestle with it. Um, just how much I was missing, like a big piece of what this is all about. So that was, it's definitely been like a big learning experience throughout it, and I'm still learning today. But I feel at this point it's just worth sharing this journey and worth talking about because I just think it's important to God. Um, and what's important to God should be important to us. So, to share a little bit about just how some of my perspectives and views changed on it, where I guess you could say, got a little bit of revelation about vulnerability, was when I joined the core team at Brave Church. And Pastor Jake basically presented us with a book by Brene Brown called Dare to Lead. And if you don't know about Brene Brown, like she's dedicated like all her research and all her study to the topic of vulnerability. So she's like a major thought leader in the area. And she had this amazing book that she wrote talking about leadership and how important vulnerability is in leadership. So I thought it was awesome that Jake wanted us as a group, as a core team, to go through the book, and it came with like exercises, and we talked about it, and it was really great. And I think just like through that season, I learned so much about how important vulnerability is, but how delicate and how we have to be careful with how we're being vulnerable and who we're being vulnerable with, when we're being vulnerable, and I think like a term that would be used to describe that would be discernment, like having discernment, because one part of vulnerability that's really important is also having boundaries at the same time, and making sure that your boundaries are being communicated well while you're also being vulnerable at the same time. So I think what I realized is like I have been being vulnerable, but my boundaries were very convoluted and not clear, which caused a lot of disruptance and relational hurt between me and other people, just other relationships in my life. So it's been just a really good lesson to learn, and I've been thinking a lot about it, and I just want to be better in relationships moving forward with knowing boundaries, communicating boundaries, but also being vulnerable with people, ultimately just to form like that connection. So I think that's just a little bit about my experience with it, and then of course being an artist, and just if you're in a creative environment, or you have aspirations of being like a creative person and artist, obviously this is just my perspective, but definitely embrace your vulnerability, but just also know your boundaries as well, and learn those, and learn how to communicate those, and you're just gonna have more success in the relational realm, I think. At least that's what I've been working on myself. So I think my encouragement is basically just being able to address when you're struggling with connection, what is getting in the way of connecting, with people, a lot of times what I found is it's pride that interferes with being vulnerable. It's self pride, which is something I'm still working on, and I'm sure I'm not too convinced that we completely stamp that out in life. I think that God is continually working to sanctify us, and which is basically to make us more like Him. But yeah, on this, as long as we're living in a fallen world, like, pride will always be something we struggle with as humans. But I think just being able to recognize it and push past it will definitely help you get better at taking moments of connection where you choose, to, with proper boundaries, communicate a form of vulnerability that ultimately just makes that connection between you and your family, your coworkers, the people you're leading, the people you're serving, whatever it is, girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, husband, anything like that. Just being able to recognize when those moments present themselves, and just knowing, and just working on it, just practicing it. Again, it is extremely scary. Just to recap everything, it's really scary because when you make that choice to be vulnerable, there is no guarantee, and it's a risk. Whether or not people will, embrace you or love you. But I think people that are vulnerable ultimately have a sign of somebody who is able to embrace vulnerability. I think is just a sign that they ultimately trust God a tremendous amount, because the more vulnerable somebody can be, I think there's a correlation to how much you trust God, because at the end of the day, even if you make a choice to step out and be vulnerable about something, and no human being accepts you for it, God, through Jesus Christ, will always accept you. So it's always it's scary, but if it's any encouragement, see it as an opportunity to build your faith. So that's what I got. Those are my thoughts on vulnerability, where I've been, what I've learned, and where I'm continuing to try to go with relationships as a result. So that's it. Hope you all have an amazing night. Hope you enjoyed this. For anybody who stayed with me for 18 and a half minutes, and I will we'll see you next time for the next vlog. Peace.